What if we could actually sit down with the founder of homeopathy, Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, and just ask him, how did this all start? Well, in this explainer, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to explore his journey, his big ideas, and the principles that kick this whole thing off. So let's get into it. So picture it. You're sitting across from a man who, over 200 years ago, took a look at the state of medicine and said, nope, there has to be a better way. What's the first thing you'd ask him? For us, it would have to be, what was it that made you so dissatisfied in the first place? So our first question for Dr. Hahnemann would be just that. What made you so fundamentally question the medicine of your time? And to really get his answer, we have to kind of step back into his world, into the 18th century, and see what he was really up against. Yeah, the so-called cures back then were, well, they were often brutal. We're talking about things like bloodletting for even a simple fever, violently purging the body, and even giving patients known poisons like mercury and arsenic. It was, to put it lightly, a pretty harsh and dangerous time to be sick. And this gets right to the heart of what was driving him. This wasn't just some scientific disagreement for Hahnemann. It was a full-blown crisis of conscience. He saw these practices as just plain harmful, and he felt like he had an ethical duty to find a gentler and frankly more effective way to heal people. So that crisis of conscience led him to a really pivotal moment. The next thing we'd have to ask him about is the one experiment that changed absolutely everything, the Cinchona experiment. This is where the story gets really fascinating. Okay, so here he is, translating a medical text, and he's reading about Cinchona bark, which was used to treat malaria. But the official explanation of why it worked just didn't sit right with him. So what does he do? In a pretty radical move, he decides to experiment on himself. He's perfectly healthy, right? But when he starts taking doses of this bark, he develops symptoms that are uncannily similar to malaria itself. And that was his aha moment. He connected the dots. If this bark causes malaria-like symptoms in a healthy person, maybe that's the very reason why it cures them in a sick person. This was the seed of an entirely new philosophy of medicine. Now, this wasn't just some random one-off discovery. No, this single experiment gave birth to the absolute foundational principle of homeopathy, an idea that would really define the rest of his life's work. He summed up this huge discovery in a simple Latin phrase that would become his guiding star, Similia Similibus Curentur. So what does that actually mean? Well, simply put, let like be cured by like. The core idea here is that instead of trying to fight symptoms directly, a doctor should use a substance that actually mimics those symptoms to gently nudge the body's own natural ability to heal itself. And this really puts it in stark contrast, doesn't it? While the medicine of his day was all about opposing symptoms, fighting fire with water, Hahnemann's new system was all about mimicking them. You could almost think of it as fighting a fire with a much, much smaller controlled fire to trigger the body's own sprinkler system. But of course, this new principle created a new challenge. When he started applying it using the raw, undiluted substances, his patients sometimes had really strong, uncomfortable reactions. He was convinced he had the right theory, but he knew the application needed some serious tweaking. His solution was this really unique two-step process he ended up calling potentization. First, he would systematically dilute the remedies over and over. Then, and this is key, at each stage of dilution, he'd shake the mixture vigorously, a process called succussion. He observed that this process seemed to not only reduce the toxic side effects, but, in his view, actually increase the substance's healing power. And this discovery led him to what is probably his most profound and definitely his most controversial conclusion. He started to believe that the true healing essence of a substance wasn't tied to its physical amount, the molecules, but to some kind of dynamic energy that was unlocked through this whole process. So all this brings us to the bigger philosophy behind homeopathy. It wasn't just about remedies and new techniques. For Hahnemann, it was a fundamentally different way of looking at the patient and the entire practice of medicine. Hahnemann, being a very systematic thinker, compiled all of his principles and his entire philosophy into this one huge work, the Organon of Medicine. His goal was to create a complete playbook, a guide for doctors to practice this new kind of medicine with logic, careful observation, and maybe most importantly, with compassion. And at the absolute core of his philosophy is this idea of individualization. Hahnemann argued that you can't just treat a disease name. You have to treat the whole person sitting in front of you. Two people could walk in with the exact same diagnosis, but their unique emotional state, their specific physical feelings, all of that meant they might need completely different, totally personalized remedies. Now, as you can imagine, these ideas were totally revolutionary, and they faced a ton of resistance from the medical establishment. So our final question for Dr. Hahnemann would have to be, how did you handle all that criticism, and what's your final message for those who came after you?
And by all accounts, he met all that opposition not with anger, but with this quiet, steady conviction in what he was doing. He just trusted what he was observing in his own patients and kept meticulously documenting his findings, believing that, in the end, the results would have to speak for themselves.
And this quote, this really captures his enduring message. It's a call to action. Be a meticulous scientist. Yes, prescribe wisely, for sure, but never, ever forget the human element. For Hahnemann, healing wasn't just a science, it was an art, guided by empathy just as much as by principles. And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Regardless of where you stand on homeopathy itself, Hahnemann's story, this journey from a crisis of conscience to building an entire medical system from the ground up, it raises these timeless questions. How do these core ideas about humane treatment, individualized care, and just being willing to challenge the status quo continue to shape and provoke how we think about medicine even today?